Welcome everyone to another lesson of Mastery Algebra 1. I'm Mr. Fuller, and in this lesson I will be showing you how to use the Pythagorean Theorem. The Pythagorean Theorem was named after a Greek mathematician named Pythagoras, who was credited with its discovery. This theorem states that there's a relationship between the sides in a right triangle. The two sides that form the right angle are called the legs, and the third side, which is across from the right angle, is called the hypotenuse. And using that terminology, the Pythagorean theorem basically states that for right triangles only, leg squared plus leg squared will equal hypotenuse squared. Many students have learned this before as a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which in our opinion is an incomplete definition because that really only works if you label the legs as a and b and the hypotenuse as c. So a better way to say the Pythagorean theorem is leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. One of the things, or the main thing, that the Pythagorean theorem allows us to do is it allows us to find a missing side in a right triangle if we know the other two sides. So let's look at examples 1 and 2 and show how we can do that. In example 1, we can see a right triangle. We can see that the legs have lengths 4 and 7, and the hypotenuse is not known. It is labeled x. So let's start with leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Now let's substitute the values into the equation. One of the legs has length 7. Let's plug that in. The other leg has length 4. Let's plug that in. And the hypotenuse is unknown. It's labeled x in the diagram. So we end up with 7 squared plus 4 squared equals x squared. 7 squared means 7 times 7, or 49. 4 squared is 4 times 4, or 16. And we have to find x. 49 plus 16 is 65. And that is x squared. So to find x, we're going to have to undo squared, or do the opposite of squaring, which is to take the square root. So x is going to be equal to the square root of 65. Now 65 is not a perfect square. It's pretty close to 8, because 8 times 8 makes 64. But we're going to need to round that to the nearest tenth. So let's go ahead and bring up our calculator and ask the calculator to do the square root of 65. And my calculator tells me it's 8.0622, etc. So if I'm rounding to the nearest tenth, I'm going to call that 8.1. 0 is in the tenths place, but after the 0 is a 6, so it rounds up to 8.1. So going back to my problem here, I'm going to say that x is approximately equal to 8.1, and the units are centimeters. Always put the units when you know them. Example 2 is very similar, except in example 2, instead of knowing both of the legs and having to find the hypotenuse, we know one of the legs is 3. The other leg, which is formed by the 90-degree angle, is called x. 8 is actually the hypotenuse in this problem. So let's go ahead and start with our formula. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. And then let's plug in what we know. One of the legs is 3. The other leg is x. And the hypotenuse is 8. So we get 3 squared plus x squared equals 8 squared. Let's simplify. 3 squared is 9. 8 squared is 64. So now this time, instead of adding the two numbers 9 and 64 like we did in the previous problem where we added 49 and 16, now we actually have to subtract. To solve this, we're going to need to subtract this 9, and that's going to give us x squared equals 55. And then the answer to x will be whatever the square root is of 55. So again, we're going to need to ask our calculator, what is the square root of 55? Unless 55 is a perfect square, which it is not. And that looks like it rounds to 7.4, because after the 4 there's a 1. So let's go back and finish the problem and say that x is approximately equal to 7.1. No, 7.4. Sorry, 7.4. And that is feet. So there are a couple of examples you can follow as you complete the rest of these problems. In a few minutes you're going to do these on your own, 1, 2, and 3. And I want to point out to you that there are scrambled answers for those at the bottom of the next page, 10.1b. So these scrambled answers are for problems 1 through 7. So as you do problems 1, 2, and 3, you should find the answers there rounded to the nearest tenth. If you don't get that answer, or one of those answers, then that means you've made a mistake and you'll need to go back and check your work. The most common mistake is to simply put the numbers in the wrong spots in the Pythagorean theorem. I'd like to continue on here and do a couple more problems with you. I'd like to do number 5. Number 5 is a little different. It's not just a straightforward Pythagorean theorem problem because we're asked to find the height and the area for the triangle that's shown. Finding the height is a straightforward Pythagorean theorem problem. This is the height, which is one of the legs of the smaller triangle on the left. This is the other leg, the two legs forming the 90-degree angle, and that makes 10 the hypotenuse. So if I start with my Pythagorean theorem, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared, then I can plug in what I know. One of the legs is 6, the other leg is h, and then the hypotenuse is 10. 6 squared is 36, 10 squared is 100. Now I'm going to need to subtract the 36. That's going to give me h squared equals 64. And then h will be whatever the square root of 64 is, which is, 64 is a perfect square, so I don't need my calculator to do that one. I know that h is 8, and the units are feet. So that tells me the height is 8 feet. So that's part of the answer. Now, the rest of the question asks for the area. So now, to do the area, I'm going to need to know the formula for the area of a triangle, which is 1/2 of the base times the height. Sometimes people do it base times height and then divide by 2. So now I just need to plug in what the base and the height are of the large triangle, not just the little one that we use to find the height in, but the large triangle, which is not necessarily a right triangle. In this triangle, the base is 14. It's all the way across the bottom. So I'm going to plug in 14 for the base. And the height is what we just calculated, 8. So now I can do 14 times 8 and then divide by 2, but I think the math is a little easier if we do half of 14, which is 7, and then multiply that by 8. That gives us 56. Now, because we have multiplied 14 feet times 8 feet, then our answer is going to be feet squared. Feet times feet makes feet squared. So the answer to this question is the missing height is 8 feet, and the area of the triangle is 56 square feet. Alright, so now it's time for you to stop the video and try the rest of these problems. And remember that the scrambled answers are at the bottom. I do want to add one more thing. For question 8, it says to use the Pythagorean theorem to determine whether each set of numbers represents the sides of a right triangle. Well, they will represent the sides of a right triangle if they work in leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So you might be looking at question A here and asking yourself, well, how do I know what the legs are and what the hypotenuse is? Well, the hypotenuse always has to be the longest side. It's across from the 90-degree angle. So we can tell that 104 would have to go in the place of the hypotenuse. So you can set this problem up as 40 squared plus 96 squared equals 104 squared. And basically you want to know, is it true? Does it equal? So as you calculate that out, if it does equal, then you know that these numbers can represent the sides of a right triangle. Or they do represent the sides of a right triangle. So go ahead and stop the video, work on the rest of these problems, check your answers, and if you have questions, ask about them when you come to class. Thank you. Remember, do your best, forget the rest. Bye for now.